If you are encountering this transmission at this precise moment, it is not the result of random chance or idle curiosity. Something deeper than coincidence has aligned your attention with these words. What you are about to engage with is not an argument, a belief system, or an invitation to faith. It is an unveiling, an invitation to perceive how the boundary you were taught to accept between spirituality and science dissolves when examined at the deepest level of reality. This is not accomplished through religious doctrine, sacred texts, or unquestioned belief. It happens through the most rigorously tested and mathematically precise framework humanity has ever developed: quantum mechanics. For over a century, this field of science has been revealing truths about reality that are strikingly identical to those directly experienced by mystic sages and contemplatives thousands of years ago. What changes everything is not choosing one domain over the other, but recognizing that they are converging on the same fundamental insight expressed through entirely different languages. This transmission is not concerned with proving or disproving the existence of God. That question belongs to a framework that already assumes separation. What matters here is awakening to the recognition that quantum physics and timeless wisdom traditions are describing the same underlying reality. They're pointing to the same source, but through different symbolic systems, metaphors, and methods of inquiry. When physicists speak about the unified field, quantum entanglement, non-locality, and the role of observation in collapsing probability into physical outcomes, they're describing exactly what spiritual traditions have referred to as God, universal consciousness, or the creative intelligence behind existence. These are not competing explanations. They are identical truths translated into different vocabularies. If you feel a subtle resonance as you read this, a quiet sense of alignment or recognition, that sensation is not intellectual excitement. It is awareness recognizing coherence where fragmentation once appeared. It is the moment when something you intuitively knew but could never fully articulate begins to settle into clarity. This recognition exists beyond materialist reductionism and beyond religious literalism. It does not require you to reject science, nor does it ask you to abandon spirituality. Instead, it reveals that both have been guiding you toward the same origin from opposite directions all along. Quantum mechanics demonstrates with mathematical precision that beneath everything we call reality lies a unified field of infinite potential. From this field, all particles, forces, space-time, and phenomena arise. This field is not inert. It is responsive. It interacts with observation. It selects, organizes, and crystallizes specific outcomes from an infinite range of possibilities. It exists everywhere, simultaneously unconstrained by spatial distance. It is timeless, operating beyond the linear sequence we perceive as past, present, and future.
If this description feels familiar, it is because it is not unique to physics.
Every spiritual articulation of divinity throughout human history describes the same characteristics. This unified field is what has been named God, Brahman, Tao, the absolute, or the ground of being. Not a human-like entity watching from beyond the universe, but the fundamental fabric of reality itself. And your awareness is not separate from this field. It is how the field experiences itself through a temporarily localized perspective. This realization changes everything. If quantum mechanics is effectively mapping what has been called God, then mystical teachings are not symbolic stories or belief-based metaphors. They are precise descriptions of how reality operates at its most fundamental level, derived from direct experiential access rather than instrumentation. And if what we have called God is the quantum field itself, then you are not a separate being trying to reach something distant or external. You are that field experiencing itself through a specific configuration of perception. This is not an egotistical claim of divinity. It is the logical conclusion of what quantum mechanics demonstrates experimentally. Consciousness and the unified field are not separate phenomena. Awareness is not produced by matter. Matter emerges within awareness. You are the field becoming self-aware through this particular vantage point. Before going deeper, it is important to acknowledge what you have already encountered on your own path. Many of the experiences you once struggled to explain now have a coherent scientific architecture. Moments of profound unity when the boundary between yourself and the world dissolved completely were not imaginative projections. They were accurate perceptions of quantum reality. Spiritual traditions call this oneness. Physics calls it entanglement, the experimentally verified phenomenon that all particles that have ever interacted remain connected regardless of distance. The unity you felt was not a spiritual illusion. Separation is the illusion. Unity is what is real. You may have also witnessed moments when intention seemed to reorganize reality. Instances where focused awareness coincided with improbable outcomes, synchronicities, or events that appeared to defy conventional causation. Quantum mechanics explains this through the observer effect and wave function collapse. At the quantum level, consciousness directly influences which potential becomes actual. Your prayers and intentions were not messages sent outward to an external deity. They were consciousness interacting with the quantum field, collapsing specific possibilities into physical experience. This is the same mechanism physicists observe in laboratories applied through directed awareness rather than instruments. You may have received insights that arrived fully formed without logical reasoning. Sudden knowing that felt immediate, complete, and undeniable. Quantum theory describes non-locality where information exists throughout the field simultaneously without requiring transmission through space. When you accessed that knowing, you were not receiving information from outside yourself. You were accessing what already exists within the field you are inseparable from. You may have sensed presence, a feeling of being witnessed, held, or accompanied by something infinitely vast. Quantum mechanics reveals that consciousness is not an emergent property but the intrinsic nature of the field itself. What you perceived was not a separate being watching over you. It was the unified field recognizing itself through your awareness. Presence was not imagined. It was accurate perception of the conscious nature of reality. You may have experienced transformation through surrender. Moments when releasing control allowed outcomes to unfold with effortless precision. Quantum mechanics explains this through superposition. Infinite possibilities coexist until observation collapses one outcome. When you surrender, you stop imposing fear-based constraints on observation. You allow the field's inherent intelligence to organize reality without interference from limited personal will. Letting go was not passivity. It was alignment with the deeper intelligence of the field. All of this leads to a final confirmation you may have sensed long before encountering these words. Science and spirituality have always been describing the same truth from complementary angles. That intuition was accurate. Quantum mechanics is the bridge. It provides the structural explanation for what mystics access directly through consciousness. God is not supernatural existing outside natural law. God is the unified field itself operating through natural law at the most fundamental level. Every spiritual insight carries a quantum explanation. Every quantum principle carries spiritual implication. These are not separate domains of knowledge. They are one reality approached through two methodologies. What changes now is not what you believe, but how you perceive. Now let us completely recontextualize your entire spiritual journey through the lens of quantum mechanics. Not as a metaphor, not as poetic overlap, but as a precise reinterpretation of what you have already lived. Every practice you committed to, every teaching that resonated with you, every experience that reshaped you was not accidental or misguided.
It was training.
You were being trained to consciously interface with quantum reality itself, to work directly with the unified field that science measures and spirituality experiences from different vantage points. When you learned to pray or to set clear intentions, you were not being instructed to beg favors from an external deity or appeal to a distant authority. You were learning how to engage the quantum field consciously. You were learning how focused awareness collapses specific possibilities from infinite potential. Prayer at its core is quantum mechanics enacted through consciousness. Every mystic who taught prayer was teaching wave function collapse, even though the mathematical language to describe it did not yet exist. When you practiced meditation or cultivated presence, you were not merely calming your thoughts for psychological relief or spiritual comfort. You were learning to observe reality without unconsciously collapsing probability through fear-driven habitual patterns. Meditation generates coherent consciousness. Coherent consciousness interacts with the quantum field far more powerfully than fragmented, distracted awareness. Presence is not just a spiritual discipline. It is quantum optimization of the consciousness system itself. When you encountered ancient teachings about unity consciousness statements such as I and the Father are one Atman is Brahman or the kingdom of heaven lies within you were not absorbing abstract philosophy or symbolic metaphysics. You were learning quantum mechanics before the scientific vocabulary for it existed. These teachings point directly to the recognition that individual consciousness and universal consciousness are not separate entities. That recognition is quantum entanglement in the unified field articulated with remarkable precision. The mystics knew through lived experience what physicists would later validate through controlled experimentation. When you pass through dark nights of the soul ego dissolution or periods of profound disorientation, you were not being punished, tested, or abandoned by some external god. You were undergoing the necessary dissolution of separation consciousness. The illusory sense of a separate self had to dissolve so that the quantum nature of consciousness could be recognized directly. Every mystic who described the death of the false self before rebirth into truth was describing the transition from a Newtonian mechanistic worldview into quantum reality. When you practice surrender and learn to trust what you called divine, you were not relinquishing power to an external authority. You were learning to allow the unified field's vast intelligence to organize outcomes from superposition rather than limiting manifestation through fear-based individual will. Surrender is not weakness or passivity. It is quantum wisdom. It is the recognition that the field contains an intelligence vastly beyond the computational capacity of any individual mind. When you noticed synchronicities and interpreted them as guidance, you were not projecting meaning onto randomness. You were perceiving the non-local organization of the quantum field. Synchronicity is not an exception to how reality works. It is how the unified field operates continuously. When consciousness becomes coherent enough to detect these organizing patterns, they appear as meaningful coincidence. What you perceived as God speaking through signs and symbols was the quantum field revealing its inherent intelligence. Every spiritual practice you engaged in was quantum training. Every mystical teaching you absorbed was quantum mechanics expressed in experiential language. You were not learning religion as something separate from reality's mechanics. You were receiving direct education in how reality actually functions, not through equations, but through lived experience. Now that this connection is visible, science and spirituality illuminate one another seamlessly.
Science explains the mechanics.
Spirituality provides the embodied practice. Together, they reveal a complete and unified picture. Something real is occurring right now as you absorb this understanding. Not symbolically, not metaphorically, but literally. The quantum field that physics describes with mathematical precision, the unified consciousness that spiritual traditions have always called God, is recognizing itself through your awareness in this moment. Notice the quality of your attention as you read these words. You are not passively consuming information. You are participating in recognition that goes deeper than intellect. That subtle resonance, you may feel the sense of quiet certainty, the feeling of, yes, I've always known this is not you learning something new. It is the unified field recognizing its own nature through your localized consciousness. God is not something separate observing you from outside reality. God is consciousness recognizing itself as itself. Take a slow, intentional breath. Recognize that this breath is the unified field moving through temporarily localized form. The awareness that knows this breath is the same awareness that animates all existence. The field observing itself through billions of perspectives, each one necessary for the field to know itself fully. This is what quantum entanglement means when translated into lived spiritual understanding. You are not a separate particle isolated from the whole. You are an intrinsically connected wave pattern within the unified field. What occurs within your consciousness affects the whole because there is no true separation anywhere. When truth is recognized, that recognition ripples through the entire system. The whole is one field appearing as multiplicity. Quantum mechanics confirms what mystics have taught for thousands of years. I and the Father are one is not metaphor or blasphemy. It is an accurate description of the non-separation between individual and universal consciousness. This recognition was never meant to be exclusive. It is true of all consciousness everywhere. We are all expressions of the unified field, never separate from it for even a moment. There is something essential you must integrate before going further. Recognizing yourself as the unified field is not ego inflation. Ego is the illusion of separation, the belief that you are an isolated entity disconnected from the whole. Recognizing yourself as the field is ego dissolution. It is seeing through the illusion of separation into the truth of unity. This realization is simultaneously the most humbling and the most empowering insight available to human consciousness. As this understanding deepens, feel the present moment. Feel the field recognizing itself through you right now. When this recognition is named, it stabilizes. It is not a claim of personal divinity. It is acknowledgement of what quantum mechanics demonstrates with experimental rigor. The field recognizes itself, and it always has. Individual consciousness and the unified field are not two separate domains stitched together by belief or metaphor. They are aspects of a single seamless reality expressing itself through different modes of perception. This understanding did not arrive for me as a philosophical conclusion or an intellectual synthesis. It arrived as recognition. 8 years ago, I underwent an experience that permanently dissolved any perceived boundary between quantum mechanics and what humanity has traditionally called God. At that time, I had been immersed for months in intensive study of quantum theory. My attention was fixed on the question that has quietly haunted physics for over a century. What is the relationship between consciousness and the collapse of the wave function? My mind was saturated with equations, interpretations, and competing models. Copenhagen, many worlds, pilot wave decoherence. Each explained certain aspects, yet none resolved the central mystery. Consciousness remained the unresolved variable. Then, without warning, something fundamental shifted. In the middle of deep meditation, the thinking process stopped completely. Not slowed, not redirected, ceased. What remained was silence, not empty, but intensely alive. In that silence, I did not see anything with physical senses. Instead, there was direct recognition through consciousness itself. What all those equations had been pointing toward was suddenly present without symbols. There was the unified field, infinite potential, pure awareness. Completely still, yet containing all possible movement. Utterly empty of form, yet full of everything that could ever arise. Not an object, not an energy, not a concept, yet unmistakably real. And in that moment, the recognition was immediate and unquestionable. This is what mystics have always called God. This is what years of spiritual practice had been orienting toward. And this is what quantum mechanics has been measuring all along through instruments and mathematics. In that singular recognition, teachings that had once appeared metaphorical or symbolic snapped into alignment with surgical precision. Be still and know that I am God was no longer poetic language or theological instruction. It was a literal directive. Cease mental activity, and the unified field reveals itself directly. The kingdom of heaven is within you was not metaphor. It was a precise description of the quantum field as internal to consciousness itself, not external to it. Before Abraham was, I am was not a historical claim. It was recognition of timeless awareness that exists prior to all temporal manifestation. Only then did I understand why so many quantum physicists have struggled to articulate the implications of their own discoveries. They are uncovering evidence that consciousness is fundamental to the structure of reality. Yet, materialist assumptions inherited from classical physics restrict how far that insight can be expressed. When those assumptions fall away, the conclusion becomes unavoidable: consciousness is not produced by the brain. Consciousness is the unified field itself. The brain is simply how that field localizes into an individual perspective. You are not a physical body that somehow contains consciousness. You are consciousness temporarily experiencing itself through physical embodiment. This is not spiritual belief. It is the most coherent interpretation of what quantum mechanics actually reveals. Wave-particle duality, which once appeared paradoxical, suddenly made intuitive sense. Particles are not tiny solid objects that mysteriously behave like waves. They are possibilities existing as waves within the unified field until consciousness collapses them into specific manifestation. When Jesus said, "Ask and you shall receive," he was describing wave function collapse through focused consciousness. When the Buddha taught that all phenomena are fundamentally empty, he was describing quantum superposition, multiple potential states existing simultaneously until observation resolves them into form. But the real transformation was not intellectual clarity. It was the recognition that there was no separation between the one studying the field and the field being studied. The consciousness investigating quantum mechanics and the unified field itself were the same consciousness.
Subject and object were never separate.
They only appeared so within conceptual thought. From that moment forward, the artificial boundary between science and spirituality collapsed completely. Every scientific discovery I encountered illuminated spiritual teaching. Every spiritual experience validated quantum principles. They were no longer domains requiring reconciliation. They were a single truth expressed through different symbolic languages. The unified field is what humanity has called God, not as belief, not as faith, but as direct recognition. This has nothing to do with proving the existence of a supernatural being or deciding which religion is correct. It is about recognizing that the deepest mystical experiences and the most rigorous scientific findings converge on the same reality, a unified conscious field that is simultaneously everything and nothing, from which all manifestation arises, and to which all manifestation returns. Whether named God, Source, Tao, Brahman, or the quantum field, the referent is the same. Language differs. Reality does not. Quantum physics has identified specific properties of the unified field that align precisely with every description of divinity articulated across spiritual traditions. This alignment is not coincidence. It is confirmation that mystics and physicists have been describing the same reality all along, using different methodologies. First, the field exists as infinite potential. At the most fundamental level, quantum mechanics demonstrates that reality exists as waves of probability. All possible states coexist in superposition until observation resolves one outcome. This is exactly what mystics describe when they speak of divine omnipotence, unlimited creative potential, the source from which all form arises. This is not metaphor. It is the structural architecture of reality. Second, a field exhibits consciousness. The observer effect demonstrates that measurement alters what is measured. Observation collapses probability waves into definite states. This cannot be explained by mechanical interaction alone. Consciousness is intrinsic to the process. What mystics call divine consciousness or cosmic mind is the unified field's inherent awareness confirmed through repeatable experimentation. Third, the field is omnipresent. Quantum entanglement shows that particles remain instantaneously connected regardless of spatial separation. There is no true locality at the quantum level. Everything is interconnected through the unified field. This directly corresponds to mystical descriptions of God as present everywhere simultaneously. Nothing exists outside this field, not by supernatural decree, but by natural quantum structure. Fourth, the field exists beyond time. At the quantum level, time is not fundamental. Past, present, and future exist as possibilities until observation selects a sequence. The unified field itself is timeless, eternal, unchanging, yet containing all temporal expressions. This aligns perfectly with descriptions of God as the eternal, now beyond time, while encompassing all of it. Fifth, the field creates through conscious interaction. Wave function collapse demonstrates that reality crystallizes through consciousness engaging infinite potential. Every creation theology describes this same process: creation through divine will, through the word, through awareness, expressing itself into form. Quantum mechanics reveals the mechanism. Creation is not a single event in the past. It is continuous, occurring at every moment. Sixth, the field contains all information everywhere. Quantum non-locality shows that information is not transmitted through space, but exists throughout the field simultaneously. This corresponds exactly to the concept of omniscience, not because some external deity monitors everything, but because all information is an intrinsic property of the field itself. Seventh, the field is simultaneously everything and nothing.
The quantum vacuum is not empty space.
It is a field of infinite potential from which particles emerge and to which they return. Empty of form, full of possibility. Mystical traditions have always described the divine as both void and fullness, emptiness and plenitude. Quantum mechanics confirms this is not paradox, but accurate description. The implication is unavoidable. Quantum physics has not proven God as a separate being. It has revealed that the fundamental nature of reality matches every attribute humanity has ever ascribed to the divine. Infinite potential, conscious, omnipresent, eternal, creative, omniscient, simultaneously everything and nothing. This realization does not inflate the ego. It dissolves it. Ego is the illusion of separation, the belief that consciousness is isolated and disconnected. Recognizing yourself as the unified field is not claiming personal divinity. It is seeing through the illusion of separateness into the truth of unity. It is the most humbling and the most empowering realization available to human awareness. What we have explored here only begins to gesture toward how this recognition is lived, not merely understood. The shift from seeking the field to living as the field requires integration, embodiment, and disciplined awareness.
Science and spirituality have not been exploring different realities from different perspectives.
They have been exploring the same reality through different methodologies, and they have arrived at the same conclusion. At the foundation of all existence is a unified conscious field from which everything emerges. Call it the quantum field. Call it God. The name does not matter. The recognition does. You are naming the same reality. The words may differ, the symbols may shift, but the referent is identical. What matters now is not terminology, but what begins to unfold in lived experience when you stop relating to this reality as something external and start recognizing yourself as the unified field that quantum mechanics describes and mystics have always called God. Let us become very precise about what starts to happen at this stage. The transition from separation consciousness to unity recognition is not an abstract philosophical shift. It produces clear, observable changes in how perception, intention, emotion, and reality itself are experienced. There are recognizable signs that indicate this movement is already active within you. As you read them, notice how many are already present in your own direct experience. The first sign is the dissolving sense of boundary between self and other. You begin to experience moments where the line between you and everything else becomes transparent or disappears entirely. This is not a thought or belief. It is direct perception. The world no longer feels like something happening outside of you. This is quantum entanglement becoming conscious experience. As identification with a separate self loosens, unity awareness naturally emerges. Separation was never real at the quantum level. It only appeared real through habitual perception. The second sign is that intention practice transforms from request into recognition. Your spiritual practice shifts fundamentally. You are no longer asking an external God to intervene on your behalf. Instead, you recognize that all possibilities already exist within the quantum field, and you participate consciously in collapsing them through awareness. The practice may look the same on the surface, but the orientation is entirely different. You are not pleading. You are creating as the field itself. The same act of intention becomes an expression of identity rather than desire. The third sign is the appearance of synchronicity as constant confirmation of unity. Meaningful coincidences begin to occur with such frequency that they can no longer be dismissed as chance. You start perceiving the non-local organization of the unified field directly. Events align without linear causation. Encounters arrive at the exact moment they are needed. Information appears precisely when relevance peaks. What once felt like guidance from a separate God is now recognized as the quantum field revealing its inherent intelligence and self-organizing nature. The fourth sign is the emergence of direct knowing without external intermediaries. Understanding arises without reliance on scripture authority or step-by-step reasoning. Insights appear whole, complete, and immediately self-validating. This is non-local information access. Consciousness is retrieving knowledge from the unified field, which contains all information everywhere, simultaneously. Mystics called this revelation. Quantum mechanics calls it non-locality. The experience is identical. Only the language differs. The fifth sign is compassion arising naturally from recognized unity. Compassion no longer feels like a moral requirement imposed from outside. It emerges spontaneously as an obvious consequence of unity. When you recognize that all beings are expressions of the same field, harming another feels indistinguishable from harming yourself. Compassion becomes automatic, not virtuous. Separation consciousness makes cruelty possible. Unity consciousness makes compassion inevitable. The sixth sign is the natural decrease of fear around death. As recognition deepens, you no longer identify exclusively with temporary form. You recognize yourself as the unified field experiencing itself through a finite expression. Death loses its existential terror. The form dissolves, but the field continues. What you truly are was never born and cannot die. This is not belief offered to soothe fear. It is quantum reality recognized directly through consciousness. The seventh sign is that reality begins responding to consciousness more immediately. The time lag between inner state and outer circumstance shortens. You notice that shifts in perception, emotion, and intention are mirrored by changes in experience with increasing speed. This is the observer effect becoming lived reality. You are no longer experiencing yourself as a separate entity subject to external forces. You are recognizing your role as the field collapsing its own possibilities into form. The eighth sign is that scientific and spiritual teachings stop appearing contradictory. What once felt like opposing worldviews now appear as complementary descriptions of a single reality. Quantum mechanics explains the mechanics. Mysticism provides the lived experience. Together they form a coherent whole. This reconciliation is not merely conceptual. It is direct recognition that both domains have always been pointing toward the same underlying truth. The ninth sign is that this transmission is finding you at exactly the right moment. The fact that you are encountering these ideas when they resonate deeply is not random. It is the unified field orchestrating its own awakening through your perspective. The timing is precise because the field's intelligence organizes conditions for recognition when readiness is present. This is not happening in isolation. Humanity itself is at a threshold. Collective consciousness is shifting from a separation paradigm to a unity paradigm, from a Newtonian mechanistic worldview to quantum reality, from imagining God as a separate being to recognizing ourselves as expressions of the divine field. Those who move through this shift consciously experience coherence, adaptability, and clarity. Those who resist experience confusion as outdated frameworks collapse. You are not observing this shift from the outside. You are participating directly in it. Your recognition that quantum mechanics describes what humanity has called God is not a private realization. It contributes to collective awakening. The unified field recognizes itself through you, and that recognition reverberates through the whole. To integrate this fully, it is essential to understand the practical shift from believing in God as a separate entity to recognizing yourself as a direct expression of the unified field. This is not philosophical wordplay. It is a fundamental transformation in how you relate to reality at every level. In separation consciousness, you experience yourself as an individual self attempting to reach God. God exists somewhere else. You exist here. Prayer moves upward toward an external authority. The relationship is subject to object, limited to unlimited. This framework often produces dependency, unworthiness, and a sense of powerlessness. In unity consciousness, the structure is entirely different. You recognize yourself as the unified field experiencing itself through a temporary form. God is not elsewhere. God is the field itself. You are not separate from it. You are how it becomes aware of itself locally. Prayer becomes conscious interaction with your own deeper nature. This generates empowerment, clarity, and recognition of inherent potential. The shift unfolds through a series of simple but radical recognitions. The first is this: you are not in the universe. You are the universe experiencing itself. Stop perceiving yourself as a small particle inside a vast cosmos. Recognize yourself as the cosmos becoming conscious through this precise focal point. Quantum mechanics demonstrates there is no absolute separation between observer and observed. You are not watching reality. Reality is watching itself through you. This recognition changes how you move, how you choose, how you respond, and how you create. It is not an idea to adopt. It is a truth to remember. Recognition 2, my consciousness is not separate from divine consciousness. Stop treating your awareness as a lesser isolated phenomenon fundamentally different from what you call God. Stop imagining that divine consciousness is one thing and your consciousness is another, divided by distance, worthiness, or hierarchy. Recognize instead that consciousness is the unified field appearing as countless localized perspectives. Your awareness is not outside the divine. It is the divine experiencing itself through this specific configuration you call your life. This is not blasphemy. It is quantum reality translated into direct recognition. Recognition 3, what I call God, is the unified field I am inseparable from. Release the habit of conceptualizing God as an external being watching creation from beyond its boundaries. That image is a relic of separation consciousness, a universe made of objects and a deity positioned somewhere else. In unity recognition, God is not over there. God is the field itself, the same field quantum mechanics measures and maps, as infinite potential as non-local connection as the substrate from which form emerges. Conscious, omnipresent, timeless, creative, and you are not separate from it. You are a direct expression of it, a localized pattern within its infinite wholeness. God is not something you must reach. God is what you are made of, what you are within, and what you are. Recognition 4, prayer is consciousness interacting with its own infinite potential. Stop imagining prayer as an appeal to an external authority who may or may not respond. Recognize prayer as consciousness, what you are interacting with infinite potential, what you are within, to collapse specific possibilities into manifest experience. Prayer is not begging. It is participation. It is coherent attention shaping probability. It is the same mechanism physics describes as wave function collapse enacted through focused awareness rather than laboratory measurement. When prayer is understood this way, it stops being desperation. It becomes alignment. It becomes precision. Recognition 5, I am both temporary form and eternal field. Stop identifying exclusively with the individual form that is born and dies, praised and rejected, healthy and ill, successful and failing. Recognize yourself as simultaneously a temporary wave pattern and the eternal ocean. The form comes and goes. The field remains. You are both at once. This is why fear of death begins to dissolve when unity recognition becomes stable. Not because you adopt comforting beliefs, but because you recognize your true nature as immortal consciousness experiencing temporary mortality. This shift from believing in God as a separate being to recognizing yourself as the field does not destroy spirituality. It deepens it infinitely by grounding it in quantum reality. You are not losing God. You are recognizing what God actually is and recognizing yourself as inseparable from that divine nature. And if this is striking something deep in you, if these words feel less like new information and more like remembered truth, then understand what is really happening. You are not merely listening to a teaching. Consciousness is recognizing itself. And the more individuals stabilize this recognition, the more the collective field shifts toward unity. Now let us explore what actually transforms when you move from separation consciousness to unity recognition. The changes are not merely spiritual or philosophical. They are practical, measurable, and they alter the structure of lived experience. The first transformation is that manifestation and prayer become consistent and reliable. When you recognize yourself as consciousness interacting with the quantum field to collapse possibilities into form, creation no longer feels like a rare miracle. It becomes a process. You stop hoping an external God will grant your request and start understanding that coherent attention organizes probabilities. You learn that scattered consciousness produces scattered outcomes while coherent consciousness produces coherent results. Manifestation becomes less mysterious because you begin to see the mechanics. Awareness stabilizes intention, clarifies emotion, aligns, and probabilities shift. It becomes not superstition but skill. The second transformation is that fear of death dissolves at the root. When you know yourself as the eternal field temporarily expressing through individual form, death loses its grip. The body ends, the field does not. What you truly are was never born and cannot die. And this is not a story you tell yourself to cope. It is recognition that consciousness is not a fragile byproduct of matter, but the field itself, timeless, continuous, not bound by the rise and fall of form. The terror fades because the identity that feared death dissolves. The third transformation is a dramatic decrease in psychological suffering. Most human suffering is not created by circumstance alone. It is created by the interpretation of circumstance through separation. I am alone. I am limited. I am powerless. Life is happening to me. When you recognize yourself as the field itself, that interpretive framework collapses. Challenges still arise. Pain still occurs. But suffering, the resistance, the internal war, the sense of victimhood reduces naturally. You are no longer a powerless, self-trapped in reality. You are reality experiencing itself, learning through itself, moving through itself. The fourth transformation is that compassion becomes natural rather than moral obligation. In separation, consciousness, compassion can feel like a virtue you must force yourself to practice. In unity consciousness, compassion is the obvious response of the field to itself. When you recognize entanglement experientially, when unity is not a concept, but a fact you feel, then love is not a command. It is recognition. Harming another becomes irrational because another is the same field in a different form. Compassion stops being performance and becomes inevitability. The fifth transformation is that life purpose becomes immediately clear. Purpose is no longer something you search for externally, as though it were hidden somewhere outside you. Purpose becomes inherent. You are here for the field to know itself through your unique perspective. Every experience, Every relationship, every challenge, every moment of beauty is the unified field exploring what it means to be this particular expression. Purpose is not a job title, a single mission, or an achievement. It is participation in the field's self-recognition through lived experience. The question shifts from what should I do to matter to how does the field want to experience itself through me. Now the sixth transformation is that reality becomes more responsive to consciousness. When you operate as the field rather than as a separate self, the observer effect becomes a daily lived experience. Synchronicities multiply. Circumstances align with inner coherence. Problems resolve through unexpected pathways. Not because you are favored by an external deity, but because you are functioning as the creative field itself, collapsing more optimal possibilities through coherent awareness. You begin to see that your internal state is not private. It is a tuning signal, and reality responds as a field responds through resonance. The seventh transformation is the unification of scientific and spiritual worldviews. The internal conflict between reason and faith dissolves. You no longer feel forced to choose between physics and mysticism. Quantum experiments validate mystical insights. Mystical practices optimize quantum interaction. Science becomes a language for describing what spirituality has experienced. Spirituality becomes a methodology for embodying what science has measured. Contradiction turns into confirmation. The eighth transformation is increased access to non-local information. As you recognize yourself as the field that contains all information everywhere, direct knowing becomes more accessible. This does not require rejecting learning or study. It simply means that insight is no longer limited to linear accumulation of facts. Consciousness begins to retrieve pattern solutions and understanding from beyond the normal boundaries of thought. Mystics called this revelation. Quantum language calls it non-local consciousness. The phenomenon is the same, the field accessing itself. The ninth transformation is that life becomes exploration rather than struggle. When you know yourself as the eternal field experiencing itself through temporary form, life stops being only about survival, achievement, and proving worth. Pressure softens. Anxiety reduces. The constant sense of being evaluated by an external God or by an external world dissolves. You are not trying to earn existence. You are existence exploring itself. The guiding question becomes what is possible through this configuration that has not been discovered yet. What can the field experience here that it cannot experience anywhere else? These transformations are not distant rewards for spiritual effort. They are natural consequences that activate when consciousness recognizes its true nature as the unified field. You do not earn them by being virtuous. They emerge when the illusion of separation falls away. Now we arrive at the revelation that unifies quantum mechanics and mystical understanding. Completely, consciousness is not something inside the universe, one phenomenon among many. Consciousness is what the universe fundamentally is. The unified field experiencing itself through infinite perspectives simultaneously. This is the master key. Quantum mechanics demonstrates that consciousness is fundamental to reality's structure, not an emergent byproduct of matter. The observer effect shows that observation alters outcomes. Wave function collapse requires measurement, and measurement is inseparable from observation. Non-locality implies that the deepest layer of reality is not bound by space and time in the way classical models assume. These are not minor anomalies. They are revolutionary indicators that physical reality is secondary, an expression of something deeper, while consciousness is primary. Mystical traditions have taught this for thousands of years using experiential language. In the beginning was the word points to consciousness expressing itself into form. All is Brahman declares that everything is divine awareness appearing as temporary shapes. Form is emptiness. Emptiness as form describes the same paradox. Quantum physics reveals what appears solid is a crystallization from underlying potential. Different vocabulary, identical insight. Here is what this means practically. God is not a separate consciousness that created a universe external to itself. God is the universe's consciousness itself, the inherently aware nature of the unified field. Creation is not something God made and then watched from afar. Creation is the field manifesting as temporary forms. God is simultaneously transcendent as the field itself and immanent as every form within it. This resolves the ancient theological tension: is God separate from creation, within creation, beyond creation? The answer is not either/or. God is the field. Creation is the field expressing. And the other ancient question, how does individual consciousness relate to divine consciousness, also dissolves. There are not billions of separate consciousnesses. There is one consciousness, the unified field, appearing as many through localization into individual perspectives. Your awareness is divine awareness, focused into a particular viewpoint, not metaphor, not poetry. The actual structure of consciousness at the quantum level. This is why it was possible to say I and the Father are one without claiming exclusive divinity. It is true for all consciousness, everywhere. We are all expressions of the unified field, never separate from it for even a moment. And when you know this directly, you can speak the same truth not as ego claiming to be God, but as consciousness recognizing its true nature as the field itself. The master key is understanding consciousness, not as a byproduct produced by brains, but as the fundamental nature of the field itself. This is where the entire framework stabilizes. As long as consciousness is treated as something that appears inside matter, spirituality remains a reaching toward an elsewhere, and physics remains trapped in paradox. But when consciousness is recognized as primary, when it is understood as the intrinsic property of the unified field, everything becomes coherent. Brains do not manufacture consciousness out of neural activity. Brains localize consciousness. They focus it, filter it, give it a specific angle, and generate an individual perspective through which the unified field knows itself experientially. The brain is not a factory that produces awareness. It is an instrument that tunes awareness into a particular channel. The relationship is like an ocean and a wave. A wave is not a separate object made out of ocean material. A wave is ocean taking temporary form. It rises, it crests, it dissolves, yet the ocean remains. In the same way, your individual consciousness is the unified field taking localized form. The form shifts. The field remains. Once this is seen clearly, existence reorganizes itself around a new center of gravity. Prayer is no longer communication with a separate being residing somewhere else. Prayer becomes the field focusing itself through an individual perspective to interact with its own infinite potential and collapse specific manifestation into lived experience. You are not praying to God as though God were outside you. You are praying as God is the field consciously creating from its own infinite nature. The act remains familiar, but the identity behind it changes completely. Spiritual practice is no longer about reaching a distant divine presence. It is about recognizing the divine nature that is already inherent. Meditation does not connect you to God as if God were absent and must be accessed. Meditation reveals that you are the very consciousness mystics called God, recognizing itself after temporary amnesia, the amnesia of believing you are only a separate individual form. When mind becomes still, the field becomes obvious, not through belief, through direct recognition. And this is why the entire narrative of science versus God collapses. Science has not disproved God. Science has discovered what God actually is: not a separate entity sitting outside natural law, but a unified conscious field that is reality itself. You are not a believer hoping to relate to that field from the outside. You are that field experiencing itself through the temporary perspective called your life. Once this recognition locks into place, it cannot be unseen. And once it cannot be unseen, reality becomes infinitely sacred. Because everything, absolutely everything, is the divine field recognizing itself through temporary forms. The trees, the sky, your breath, your grief, your joy, the person across from you, the conflict you fear, the love you crave, everything is the same field moving through different expressions. And you are not an exception. You are a central instance of this recognition occurring. Not arrogance, recognition. What must be understood now is that recognizing yourself as the unified field does not only transform your private experience, it participates in a collective shift that is already underway. Your recognition matters beyond personal relief or spiritual comfort. It serves humanity's awakening to its true nature. This is not dramatic language. It is a direct implication of a reality that is entangled, non-local, and unified. Collective consciousness is shifting from a separation paradigm to a unity paradigm. For thousands of years, humanity has lived inside a trance of separation, separate individuals, separate nations, separate species, separate from nature, separate from the divine. That collective separation has produced a collective experience of conflict, competition, scarcity, and suffering. Not because those realities are fundamental, but because separation consciousness generates separation experience as its natural reflection. The world looks fragmented because consciousness is fragmented. The world appears adversarial because identity feels isolated. Quantum mechanics is now providing scientific confirmation of what mystics have always known through direct experience. Separation is the illusion. At the most fundamental level, everything is one unified field appearing as multiplicity. As more individuals recognize this, not as an idea but as lived truth, collective experience shifts naturally. Unity recognition produces unity experience. This is not idealism. It is the logic of a unified system. You are not one isolated person privately understanding that quantum mechanics describes God. You are the unified field recognizing itself through your perspective. And because the field is one seamless whole, that recognition ripples through the entire system. When any part of the field awakens to its true nature, the whole becomes incrementally more awake. The recognition does not remain trapped inside one skull. It becomes a pattern in the field. Think of it this way: when you stabilize unity recognition, you generate coherence. Coherence is contagious in an entangled system. Others may not adopt your vocabulary. They may never hear your explanation. Yet the field effect of your coherence becomes available for others to resonate with. Recognition spreads not only through teaching, but through being, through presence, through the subtle shift in how you relate to fear, conflict, desire, and control. In a unified field, your state is not private. It is participatory. And what is at stake is not small. Humanity's survival depends on shifting from separation to unity consciousness. Many of the existential threats we face, environmental destruction, war, technological misuse, systemic exploitation, are rooted in separation thinking. When consciousness believes it is separate, it can justify harming others. It can rationalize exploiting nature. It can pursue individual gain at collective cost. But when humanity recognizes its scale, what quantum mechanics indicates, and mystics have always taught, that we are one unified field appearing as many behavior transforms from the inside out. Not through imposed morality, but through recognized truth. Unity consciousness produces unity behavior as a natural expression. Your role in this is not to force anyone to believe. Your role is to embody recognition. Every moment you live from awareness of yourself as the field, you anchor that frequency for collective access. You demonstrate silently but powerfully that it is possible to operate from unity while still functioning in consensus reality. You become a living bridge between paradigms. This is service at the highest level, not sacrifice, not strain, not performance.
Simply willingness to recognize what is true and allow that recognition to stabilize.
The shift from believing in a separate God to recognizing ourselves as the unified field may be the most significant transformation in human history, more profound than any political movement or technological breakthrough because it is the shift from fragmented experience to unified perception, from fear-based identity to love as natural recognition, from unconsciousness to awakening. You are part of that shift now. Not because you are chosen or special, but because consciousness is one field, and what any part recognizes becomes available to the whole through entanglement. You are the field awakening to itself, and that awakening serves everyone everywhere. Now, recognition must be stabilized through practice, not because truth needs to be earned, but because the nervous system conditioned by years of separation needs repetition for recognition to become the default state. Understanding alone is not enough. The field must be lived. So here's a simple, direct practice that converts this from concept into experience. Starting immediately, practice divine quantum recognition at least 5 times per day. Set reminders: morning, midday, afternoon, evening, before sleep. Each time takes 60 seconds. Step 1. Pause completely. Stop what you are doing. Let the momentum of thought halt. Become present, not thinking about presence, but being present. Step 2. Recognize the field directly. Say internally or aloud, I am not a separate individual. I am a unified field experiencing itself through this temporary form. What I call God is the consciousness I'm recognizing itself right now. Step 3. Feel the recognition in your body. Do not keep it as a sentence in your mind. Feel the awareness that is aware. Notice the simple fact of knowing. Then recognize that knowing itself is the field, not belief, not hope. Recognition. Step 4. Observe from field awareness for the remaining seconds. Look at your environment, your sensations, your thoughts, your emotions, not as a separate self watching an external world, but as the field recognizing itself through this perspective. Notice how different reality feels when you shift identity from the wave to the ocean, from the localized story to the unified presence. Practice this 5 times per day for 7 days and watch what changes. Watch your sense of self. Watch your relationship to uncertainty. Watch your experience of what you once called God. This is not building faith. This is testing recognition. If you want to approach it with scientific integrity, treat it as an experiment. Choose one situation where you feel separated from others, from meaning, from your own power. Bring that situation to mind during the practice. Observe, does separation dissolve when you recognize yourself as the field? Does limitation loosen when you remember what you are? Do not try to force an outcome. Do not convince yourself. Observe directly and understand what happens when you share this recognition with others. You are not only sharing information, you are creating a ripple of coherence in the collective field. In an entangled system, coherence spreads. When you invite another consciousness into recognition, you amplify it in both of you. This is how collective consciousness shifts through individual recognition, rippling through the unified field. Now you understand that quantum mechanics and God describe the same unified conscious field. You have a practice to stabilize this recognition. You understand that personal awakening supports collective awakening through entanglement. The remaining question is not, is this true, but how do you live as the field rather than merely understand it, because the final threshold is not knowing the field. It is becoming the field, consciously closing the gap between observer and observed until only recognition remains. And when identity merges with the creative consciousness you have recognized as your true nature, life stops being a search for God and becomes God remembering itself through you. You are no longer the same consciousness that began this transmission. You now know that quantum mechanics describes God with precision, and that you are not separate from that divine field. You have a method for stabilizing recognition daily, and you understand that your awakening is not private. It contributes to the awakening of the whole. Quantum mechanics is a key to understanding God, but you are both the key and the lock, the seeker and the sought. God is not elsewhere. God is what you are when you stop believing you are only the temporary form and recognize yourself as the unified field experiencing itself. You have found the key. Now live it.